Baik, selamat siang Bapak dan Ibu, selamat pagi untuk Maria, Sonja, dan Katherine. Terima kasih sudah hadir dalam kelas daring linguistik pada hari ini tanggal 7 Oktober 2020. Tema yang akan kita diskusikan pada siang hari ini adalah tentang corpus annotation and discourse studies with language documentation corpora. Sebelum kita mulai, Bapak Ibu izinkan saya memperkenalkan pembicara kita pada hari ini. Yang pertama ada Maria Bardají. Maria menamatkan studi tentang modern languages and literature di Barcelona, kemudian menyelesaikan kuliah master dalam bidang linguistik di University of Cologne, Jerman, dan sekarang sedang menulis disertasi tentang nominalization in Western Austronesian languages. Selain itu, Maria juga bekerja untuk proyek dokumentasi bahasa Totoli. Kemudian pembicara kedua pada hari ini, Sonja Riesberg. Sonja saat ini kegiatannya banyak sekali Bapak Ibu, saya hanya bacakan 3 yang termutakhir. Sejak Januari 2017, Sonja menjadi postdoctoral research fellow di Australian National University. Kemudian sejak Januari 2017, dia juga sebagai postdoctoral research fellow di proyek SFB, ya, Prominence in Language, University of Cologne. Kemudian sejak 2012 sampai 2016, Sonja juga sempat menjadi postdoctoral research fellow di Department of General Linguistic, University of Cologne. Dan saat ini banyak dokumentasi bahasa yang telah dikerjakan oleh Sonja, dan Corpora tentang bahasa tersebut dapat Bapak Ibu akses di Language Archive MPI Nijmegen. Dan korporanya tentang bahasa Totoli, kemudian ada juga tentang bahasa Yale, Kosarek, dan Papuan Malay. Kemudian pembicara kita yang ketiga, Katherine Walker. Katherine mendapatkan master di bidang linguistik tentang nominal classifier in Papuan languages of West Papua dari University of Cologne, dan sekarang sedang mengambil PhD di University of Amsterdam. Bapak Ibu, itu perkenalan saya tentang ketiga pembicara kita. Dan untuk Maria, Sonja, dan Katherine, peserta kita hari ini kurang lebih 75 orang. Ya, sambil menunggu semua peserta hadir, kita mulai saja. Kemudian peserta yang ikut kelas ini dari Sumatera ada sampai ke timur, Sonja. Dan kalau lihat daftar peserta, paling timur dari Nusa Tenggara Timur. Dan peserta ada yang peneliti, language researcher, students, and also professor. Ada juga. Jadi sangat variatif, dan dengan topik yang penting dan menarik hari ini, saya pikir akan menambah pengetahuan para pendokumentasi bahasa di Indonesia tentang anotasi korpus. Untuk tidak berlama-lama, saya silakan kepada Maria, Sonja, atau Katherine untuk memulai presentasi. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih dan selamat siang waktu Indonesia Barat, selamat pagi waktu Eropa kepada semua peserta di kelas ini. Saya mau ucapkan terima kasih kepada Ibu Anik yang undang kami sebagai pembicara di kelas ini. Kami senang sekali mendapatkan kesempatan presentasi penelitian kami, tapi kami harus minta maaf ya karena kami akan presentasi dalam bahasa Inggris. Karena sebenarnya belum cukup lancar bahasa Indonesia dan juga ada teman dari Belanda yang ikut kelas hari ini juga dan tidak tahu bahasa Indonesia sama sekali. Jadi saya minta maaf, we will switch to English for the presentation. Tapi nanti kalau ada pertanyaan, bisa tanya dalam bahasa Indonesia juga. Kami akan coba menjawab. Kalau ada masalah, nanti Ibu Anik mungkin bisa bantu. Karena dia tahu bahasa Jerman, dan bahasa Inggris, dan bahasa Indonesia, dan bahasa Bali juga. Okay, so we'll start. As Anik said, we will talk about corpus annotation and discourse studies with language documentation, Corpora, and we will present to you 2 case studies conducted with 2 corpora of languages, both spoken in Indonesia. One is the Austronesian language, Totoli, which is spoken by about 5,000 speakers in Sulawesi Tengah. And the other one is the Papuan language, Kamang, spoken by about 6,000 speakers di Pulau Alor. These projects are, these languages, the case studies we are presenting are part of 2 projects. One, the Totoli study, is part of a project called Prominence-Related Structures in Western Austronesian Symmetrical Voice Languages, led by Nicolaus Himmelmann at the University of Cologne. And the other one is Eva van Leer's project on the typology of alternating verbs at the University of Amsterdam. So I will very briefly present to you why Totoli and Kamang are interesting languages and what our particular research questions within these 2 projects are. So Totoli is a so-called symmetrical voice language. That means it looks something like that. It has 2 transitive constructions like the ones illustrated here, iali nambarong deok itu and deok itu nimbarong iali, which basically both mean the same thing. Basically, they both mean Ali threw something at the dog. The sentence in A is a so-called actor voice construction where the actor, Ali, is the subject, and the non-subject argument, here the dog, is the undergoer, which occurs directly after the verb. And in the second construction in B, we basically have the mirror image of that, the so-called undergoer voice, where the undergoer argument is the subject, deok itu here, the dog, and the actor is the non-subject argument. So we have 2 basic transitive constructions, and our research question then is, is it not moving? How do Totoli speakers choose one transitive construction over the other? So that's what we are interested in this project. Kamang is interesting because it has a series of 6 different pronominal prefixes that index the patient-like argument on the verb, like you see 2 examples here in 2A and 2B, Leon na taxi and Leon ne fan, sorry, I don't speak Kamang. So we have 2 transitive constructions here as well, and you see that we have 2 different prefixes that are indexing the patient. One is na and the other one is ne. There are 4 other options which are not mentioned here, but Katherine will talk about them in a bit. So the question here is, what is the difference between these prefixes and what verbs take which prefix? So research question here, what factors play a role in the use of which prefixes with which verbs? So to answer these kind of research questions, we cannot just simply look at one or two examples. We also cannot just ask speakers. So we can't ask a Totoli speaker, so how do you choose voice, right? But we have to look at larger stretches of discourse, or that's at least one possibility to find something out about these questions that we are asking. And we want to introduce to you 3 annotation schemata which add specific information to Corpora in order to make it easier to answer these kinds of questions. So the schemata we will be introducing are GRAID, refined, and reflex. And Maria will talk about these in a bit, what they do and where they come from. And then we'll show you how we applied these annotations to answer our research questions. So just to note, we are of course not the first ones to use these annotations. We are also not the ones who invented them. There is a growing database called Multicast, Multilingual Corpus of Annotated Spoken Texts, which was initiated by a group of linguists from the University of Bamberg. You see here on the slide parts of their website. Their aim was to enable cross-linguistic research in an area, in the area of discourse and grammar. And on this website, you find a lot of information. You find the manuals down here, but you also see a map of those languages where annotated data is already available. And you see there are already a number of Austronesian languages as well. So there's Nafsan, Vera, Teop, which are all Oceanic languages. There's also one language from Indonesia, Tondano, spoken in Sulawesi Utara. So you don't have to be part of Multicast. You can use the annotation guidelines. They're all freely available on the website. They can be downloaded. And you can take a look at annotated corpora to see how GRAID and refined and reflex have been applied to other languages. And then if you want, you can also make your annotated data available to facilitate cross-linguistic research. So in the following, Maria will introduce to you the GRAID, the refined, and the reflex schemes, how they are used, categories. Then I will talk a little bit about the discourse study that we conducted in the Totoli project. Then Katherine will talk about the Kamang study. And then in the end, we'll give some practical advice on how to use these annotations with Corpora. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Maria now.
Yes, thank you very much, Sonja. I'll share the screen. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. We will, I will explain these 3 annotation schemata. We will start with GRAID, because if you want to annotate with this schemata, and apply the 3 of them, you will need to start with this one. GRAID stands for Grammatical Relations and Animacy in Discourse. And it was developed by Haig and Schnell. And in this publication from 2014, you will see it at the end in the references, you can find a manual where they explain all the labels and the purpose behind that, and they give all the details. And the main, this GRAID annotation is an annotation convention for the coding of grammatical relations, morphological forms, and animacy features of referential expressions. The main purpose behind it is to facilitate, as Sonja said, quantitative cross-linguistic investigations of natural discourse. So to look at different things that we cannot see at first sight. So broadly speaking, how does it work? Yes. Well, we first take a file that we want to annotate, and then we need to first divide it into clauses. GRAID distinguishes between independent clauses and dependent clauses. Independent clauses are marked, you will see it later in an example, by 2 hashtags, and dependent clauses by 1. Within dependent clauses, we can also specify the type of subordinate that we are annotating, so we can tag an adverbial clause with AC, a complement clause, or a relative clause. And then if the end of the dependent clause is not coinciding with the end of the main clause, we will need to mark this end with this percentage sign. And then GRAID gives the option to annotate extra information about these clauses. If we think that it would be relevant, we can also, but we don't have to, mark if this is a negative clause or if it's a direct speech. And so we can see it here in an example. We have this sentence, the guy we talked about is coming later. And here we have a main clause, which we will mark at the beginning with these 2 hashtags. And then we have a relative clause we talked about within the sentence. So we mark the beginning of the relative clause with this 1 hashtag RC, and then we delimit this relative clause with a percentage sign. And then now that we have marked the limits of the clauses, we can go on to tag referring expressions and the predicates of this clause. Basically, the structure of a GRAID label is the following one that you see here. We mark the form, the feature, and the function of referential expressions and predicates. And it's important to notice the punctuation. There's this dot, which links semantic features to the forms, and then the double dot, which links functions to the form. And now we are going to look at all the possible labels that we can annotate, or the main ones. As for the form of arguments, the main distinction in GRAID is made between lexical arguments, which are marked by NP, pronominal arguments, which are tagged with pro, and zero arguments marked by a 0, which means that an argument position is not filled by any overt referring expression. And then we can also tag verbs with lexical verbs with a V or as an auxiliary, and there are several other labels that you can find in the guidelines, and you can decide to apply them or not, depending on whether they are relevant or not in your language or in your research. So if we had to annotate the form of the referring expressions in this example, we would start with the guy, marking it as a lexical NP. Then we as a pronoun, talked as a verb. In this relative clause, there's an argument missing, well, I mean non-overt. So we would add a 0 argument, is would be glossed as an auxiliary, coming as a verb, and later as other. And then, if it's relevant, we can link features to these forms. The 2 semantic parameters that are annotated in GRAID are animacy and person. With regard to animacy, we can use an H to mark human reference, or a D to mark anthropomorphized reference, and those are animals or plants with human-like characteristics and abilities, like the ones that you can see, for example, in traditional folk tales, which are animals and plants that are capable of speech or that have emotions and talk and move. And we may not want to mark them as humans, but also not as inanimate objects. And then if we don't have an animacy feature marked in the label, we can deduce that it's not a non-human referent, it's a non-human referent. Oh, sorry. And then if we have an element marking person as a pronoun, we can also specify if it's a first person referent or a second person referent. And if we have no marking, that tells us that it's third person. So in the sentence we had, we have 3 features to mark. In the guy, we will mark that this is a human referent. We signals first person, so we would add this one here, and the 0 argument is referring to a human reference, so we would add also a dot at an age as well. And then to complete the label, we need to add the function of the referring expressions or of the verbal elements. And for referring expressions, we can mark core arguments with S, A, and P. The S stands for the subject of an intransitive subject predicate. The A stands for the subject of a transitive predicate, and the P for the object of a transitive predicate. And then if we have other non-core arguments, we can mark them as a goal, as a locative, or as an oblique argument. And if we have a predicate, we can mark it with pred. And if in the case that this is an existential predicate, we can mark it with predex. So if we continue with the annotation of our example, we have in the main clause a predicate, and we mark it as such. In this case, this is an intransitive predicate with a single argument, so we mark it with an S, as in here. And then in the relative clause, we have a transitive predicate, we mark the predicate with pred, and then we have a transitive subject, the agent here, and then we talked about him, the 0 argument, and we mark it with a P, because this is the object of the transitive predicate. And in this way, as you can see here, the label is already complete, but we may add information if we think that it's important in the language we annotate, or if it could be relevant for the research question we have in mind. And for example, before the label, we can add if this is a clitic argument with an equal sign. We can also say that that's an affix. We can also link elements from a verbal phrase or a nominal phrase by saying that something is right from the verb or from the noun, that something is left from the verb or from the noun. And for example, if you think that plural or plurality is an important parameter in your research, you can also add a plurality marking with this PL and then an underscore, and whatever you think is important, you can link it to the label by an underscore. So we can see it here. For example, we want to mark that the article belongs to the nominal phrase by telling that the article stands left from the noun, and then we can also say that that about is part of this verbal phrase talked about, so we want to link it with a verb by saying that it's right from the verb. And then, for example, we have this 0 argument, and we may think it's relevant to mark that it's not a usual 0 argument, but this is an argument that occurs in a relative, and a 0 that occurs in a relative clause. So we can mark it here. And then it's important, or it's very difficult that GRAID as its most basic form can be applied to all languages. in the way that it is in the manual. In our case, for example, annotating Totoli, we had the following problem. As Sonja told you, in underscore voice predicates, like in this one, Nipudugnako, he picked him up. We have an underscore argument, which is here non-overt, the 0 argument, and which is the subject of the construction. And by contrast, this critical pronoun, which is the actor of the construction, is the non-subject argument. If we used the GRAID annotations, these A and P, as they describe it in the manual, we would be telling here that this actor argument is the subject of the construction, whereas this patient argument is the object. And this is not the case. Precisely in underscore voice construction, it is the argument, the underscore argument, which is the subject of the construction. So we need a different label to mark voice predicates in Totoli. What we did is we added the voice in the predicate and in the arguments, and we interpreted this A and P as semantical roles. So from the combination of the semantical role, the P and the A, with the voice, we can extract which one is the syntactic function of those arguments. So if we find a P from an underscore voice or an A from an actor voice, we will know that this we're talking about subject arguments. And if we find an argument that is tagged as an A of an underscore voice or as a P from an actor voice, we have their non-subject arguments. And so you will see in your language how you have to apply, modify, and customize these GRAID labels so that they adjust best in your language. And after GRAID is annotated, then you can just try to answer different questions. It depends on the type of research you're making, but just as an example, Heik and Schnell list different possibilities in their guidelines. For example, with the GRAID labels, you could investigate what is the ratio of arguments to predicates in a given text, or for example, how frequent are human expressions in different syntactic functions. And I don't know, just imagine that you annotated all negated clauses. So you could answer, for example, the question of, do negated clauses differ from affirmative ones in the way that arguments are realized, and along, etc. Then besides GRAID, we may add a second annotation layer. This one is refined. Refined is stands for reference indexing in natural language discourse. It was invented by Schibor, Schnell, and Thiele, and you will find also a manual of Refine in this publication of 2018. And in this annotation convention, we want to track all discourse reference. So the main challenge here is to decide what is considered a discourse reference and what is not. And once you have decided that, each reference receives a numeric index, we will see it now with an example, which is annotated throughout the text at each mention of the reference, irrespective of the lexical item used to refer to it, and also irrespective of whether it is an overt or a non-overt mention. So we will see it here with a piece of discourse. We have here the beginning of a story. This story goes on like that. Hiduplah seorang pria tua yang memiliki 4 orang anak. Ia ingin anak-anaknya tidak menjadi manusia yang terlalu cepat menghakimi sesuatu. Untuk itu, ia mengirimkan mereka untuk melihat pohon pir yang berada jauh dari rumah mereka. Anak pertama mengatakan pohon itu terlihat jelek. And then it goes on, but we will stop here. And we will try to track the discourse reference we find here. If we start from the beginning, we find 17 orang pria, this an old man. Since this is the first reference, we will mark it with a number 1. We will give it this, this numeric index. And then we continue, yang memiliki 4 orang anak. So in this sentence, we have a 0 argument, which is referring to this old man. So we will continue giving this reference the number 1. And then we have a new referent, orang anak, these 4 children. So these 4 children are a new reference, so they get a new number, number 2. The story continues, ia ingin anak-anaknya tidak menjadi manusia yang terlalu cepat menghakimi sesuatu. So he, again the old man, so again number 1, didn't want his children, so the children get the number 2, but the possessive pronoun here, nya, is referring to the man, so that gets number 1 as well. And it continues, untuk itu ia, so he, again the old man, again number 1, sent them, again the children, number 2, untuk melihat pohon, to see, to watch a pear tree, number 3, because this is a new argument, which was far away from their house. The house is a new argument, so we have a 4 and a new number as well. And then here, their house, this pronoun refers now to the family. So the man and the 4 children together. We already had them separate, but now we are referring to them as a group. Since this group wasn't mentioned yet, we need a new number. And then we have the first child who said that the tree looked bad. The first child wasn't mentioned yet. We mentioned the group, but we didn't mention the first child as an individual. So we give it a new number, and then we have again the tree, which we already had, so we give it the same index number. It's also important to notice what we didn't annotate as referring expressions. So we have the sentence where he didn't want his children to become people who judge things too fast. In this case, manusia and sesuatu are not referring to real world entities which are identifiable, but so we don't give them a numeric index. And then here as well, pohon tree, a pear tree. In this case, pears are not referring to identifiable entities, so we don't give this word a numeric index because we don't consider it referential. And then with refine can be complemented with a simplified version of reflex. This is a referential and lexical scheme, which is a simplified version based on the scheme of Baumann and Riester, 2012 and 2017. But if you want to learn about the reflex system, you can look at these 2 publications. However, if you want to know how to apply the simplified version with refine, you will find the information in the manual I told you before of refine developed by Schibor, Schnell and Thiele. And with this 3rd layer of annotation, we want to check reference according to their information status. So in this version, we involve a 4-way distinction between given, new, unused, and bridging reference. First mentions are labeled as new. except if they are globally known reference, for example, the sun or the President of America, which are labeled as unused. And also except if the reference are inferable from context. In this case, we will label them as bridging. So that would be the case if I am talking about a house, and then at some point I mention the windows of the house. In this, somehow the listener can infer that the windows are not a new reference, but it's inferable from the context. And then if we, and then given is the status of all arguments that have been mentioned already once in this course, and they get no annotation. So if we want to try to apply reflex in the story we had different 6 new mentions. We had the man, which was a new referent, and then his children, which were new as well. And then we had the tree, which was new as well, and the house, which was new. But then we had this pronoun, mereka, which stands for the group of consisting of the man and his children. And they were mentioned separately, they weren't mentioned as a group. That's why it's a new mention, but we cannot say that this information is brand new. Since the members of this group were already mentioned, we can say that this group is already inferable from the context, so we will mark it as bridging. And the same in the opposite direction. We will do the same with anak pertama. We have already the first mention for the 4 children, but the members of this group weren't mentioned separately, so that's why they get a new number. But since the group was already mentioned, we will say that this is not a new mention, but a bridging reference. And this is the way in which we annotate with these 3 schemata. And now Sonja, will explain you how we used this annotation in a discourse study of Totoli, in which we annotated with GRAID and refined and reflex. Sonja, your micro.
You're muted.
Yes.
Sorry, it's better. Okay, so I'll talk about the Totoli discourse study where we annotated spoken Totoli data, which we took from 2 larger corpora. One was compiled within the project that I mentioned earlier, the prominence-related structures in Western Austronesian symmetrical voice languages, funded by the German Research Foundation. And the other one is from a documentation corpus, which was funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. So we've seen this example before. These are the 2 transitive constructions in Totoli, the actor voice and the undergoer voice, one time with the actor subject, the other time with the undergoer subject, both of them equally transitive. Both of them are also morphologically marked. So in the actor voice, we have an actor voice prefix on the verb, non, and in the undergoer voice, we have the undergoer voice prefix, ni. So you see why these languages are called symmetrical voice language. They have a voice alternation that allows for the relinking of semantic arguments to syntactic function, but unlike in the active-passive alternation, there is no argument demotion. So you have a voice alternation without any decrease in valency. So just to summarize that very briefly, a symmetrical voice language or a language is symmetrical if it has more than one basic transitive construction and if the verb is morphologically equally marked in all different voices. And this makes these languages very different from asymmetrical languages. So symmetrical voice alternations are very different from active-passive alternations syntactically. But what also makes these languages different from active-passive alternations is their distribution in discourse. And here you see a number of languages or language corpora for which there is literature available. So you see, for example, in language corpora like Bessemer or Pendau, we almost get an equal distribution of active voice and undergoer voice. So that's almost 50-50, not quite, but almost. And in other languages, if you have a preference for one voice over another, it's usually a preference for the undergoer voice, right? So this is also the case in Totoli. In our large corpus, we get a distribution of about 72% of undergoer voices and 28% of active voices. So that's also what you see here, right? This big lump is the undergoer voices, and the around 30% up here are the active voices. Now, even if the distribution of active voice and undergoer voice in symmetrical voice languages is not strictly speaking symmetrical, so it's not always 50-50, it clearly differs from what has been reported for asymmetrical voice languages. So for example, for English, it has been reported that in finite verb forms in conversations, there are only 2% passives, right? So you have a very, very small percentage of passives and everything else is active. So that's different in these symmetrical voice languages. So the question, what determines voice choice in Austronesian symmetrical voice languages has occupied linguists for quite a long time now, since the early 1980s, basically. And here you see the usual suspects that have been proposed in the literature. So the first one, definiteness and specificity. Here's the claim basically that undergoer voices have to be used if the undergoer is definite or specific, right? So if you get a specific undergoer argument, you have to make it the subject. You have to choose an undergoer voice. The other classic factor is, of course, topicality. And topicality is usually measured in two ways. You can either look at referential distance. So that's the distance to the previous mention, or we can look at topic persistence. So we can look how persistent is a referent in the upcoming few sentences. That's been proposed by Givon and has been applied by a lot of people for quite a lot of languages. And then eventiveness or discourse transitivity has also been claimed to play a role. For example, Kamang has found for classical Malay that undergoer voices are higher in discourse transitivity, and they are more likely than active voices to occur in foregrounded or sequenced or new clauses. Bradley MacDonald's thesis, PhD thesis on Bessemer is the most recent and the most detailed study on this topic to date. And his work basically provided the basis for our study as well. And he looked at a lot of factors, many more than the ones listed here. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll first talk a little bit about our corpus. So for the present study, we have annotated a total of 2 hours and 50 minutes of 27 different spoken texts involving a total of 53 speakers, 26 of which were female and 27 were male. Most of them were adults, and all of them live in bilingual Totoli Indonesian speaking households. Within these 27 texts, we annotated 3,152 clauses. But for our analysis, we could only use 962 clauses. And why is that? That's because we're only interested in transitive voice-marked clauses. We need to have a voice-marked transitive clause with 2 arguments, right? So we excluded non-voice-marked predicates. We excluded intransitive clauses. We excluded everything in Indonesian, so that was not Totoli speech. But we also excluded relative clauses and complement clauses because in these kinds of constructions, there is actually no voice choice really. In relative clauses and complement clauses, voice choice is to determine syntactically. So we had to exclude those as well. So that's why we ended up with these 962 clauses. And then we made sure that our corpus contained a variety of genres and text types. And that makes it very different from other studies because previous studies, most of them have only looked at narratives. And then there are a few exceptions, 2, I think, but they have only looked at conversations. So in our corpus, we tried to make sure that we have a diverse corpus along 2 major parameters. So we included conversational data, but we also included monologues. And then we try to vary in the text type, where text type is definitely basically defined by the topic that speakers are talking about. So we have conversations, but also traditional folk tales, personal experiences, which could either be conversational or monologue, procedural texts, which again could either be conversational or monologue, and then special kinds of elicited data, right? Task-oriented, or the retelling of the Pear movie. I'm sure you've heard about that film clip where people retell a video clip, basically. So this is the list of factors that we investigated. And as I said, we have been strongly influenced by Bradley MacDonald's PhD thesis on Bessemer. Basically, we took all the factors that he investigated as well. The only thing that we added, because he only looked at conversational data, we also added text type and interactivity as an additional factor. But we're not going to talk about all that today. Today we will only discuss humanness, because that will show you that that's something you can easily do with the GRAID annotations. And then we will talk a little bit about topicality, because that's such a prominent topic in the literature, yeah, because it has been done for so many languages and we can compare it to that. So let's very briefly look at humanness. This is what we found for humanness. And remember, our research question was, we want to determine, we want to know what determines voice choice in Totoli. So the pink or salmon color here are the actor voices, right? And the green turquoise is the undergoer voices. And then down here on the axes, you have H, which stands for human, and NH, which stands for non-human. What is left of the arrow is the actor, and what is right of the arrow is the undergoer. So you have to read this in the following way. Here in this column, a human actor is acting on a human undergoer. So if we have a transitive clause with a human actor and a human undergoer, we get a lot of undergoer voices, right? We get like almost 80% undergoer voices, and we get like 20% actor voices. On the other hand, if we have a non-human actor acting on a non-human undergoer, we get more actor voices. So let's look very briefly how we get that information from our annotations. Here you have an example sentence, again, a transitive clause. Tao magala kayu, the boys, the people picked up the wood. So we have an actor argument, which has been annotated as human, right? And we have an undergoer argument, the P, which doesn't have an annotation, which means it's inanimate. And we also know that we are talking about an actor voice. So this is the subject, this is the non-subject. So human actor acting on a non-human undergoer in the actor voice means that we are talking about this column here. And the clause we are talking about is an actor voice. So it's part of these 218 tokens, right? So does humanness tell us something about voice choice in Totoli? It looks very promising at first sight, right? As I already said that, it seems to be the case that if we have non-human actors acting on non-human undergoers, we get more actor voices than usual. And it is indeed statistically significant. But if you look at the tokens, you see that we are talking about very few instances here, right? So these are only 7 instances we're talking about, and these are only 17. So it does play a role. It is statistically significant, but the vast majority of cases here, humanness doesn't really tell us much, right? Because here we basically get the normal distribution that we also get in the overall corpus. Okay, but this is something that you can very easily gain through your GRAID annotations, right? So let's talk a little bit about topicality, and we'll start with referential distance. Referential distance measures the degree of continuity of a discourse referent by looking at the previous discourse environment, right? So we're looking to the left, basically. And this has been measured in different ways in the literature. So the first way, which originally was suggested by Givon in '83, was by counting the number of clauses between a given referential expression and its last mention, where the maximum volume that was assigned was arbitrarily set by 20. So after 20 clauses, we stop counting, basically. Second, by applying either a 3-way distinction. So we look, is the previous mention 1 clause away? Is it 2 or 3 clauses away? Or is it 3 or more clauses away, right? Or a 2-way distinction. Is the previous mention 1 to 3 clauses away, or is it more than 3 clauses away? And finally, people have been looking at relative distance from 2 arguments in a transitive clause to their previous mention. So in this last case, we would measure whether the referential distance of an actor argument is shorter than the referential distance of the undergoer argument. I see. But in all cases, regardless on how you measure, the idea is the shorter the distance between a referential expression and its previous mention, the higher degree of topicality. Right, so we have been looking at relative referential distance of actors and undergoers. So again, same color coding, right? Green is the undergoer voices, salmon pink is the actor voices. And on the x-axis now you see if the referential distance of the actor is shorter than of the undergoer, we get a little bit more of actor voices. If the referential distance of the undergoer is shorter than of the actor, we get a little bit more of undergoer voices. If it's equal, we more or less get the normal distribution that we get in the whole corpus. So for referential distance, if you want to measure that, both actor and undergoer need to have been mentioned in the previous mention, in the previous discourse, right? So that's why we need GRAID, of course. We also need refined, and we need reflex, because that will tell us whether the referent is given or not. We are only interested in given reference for this, basically. And that's why the set that we are talking about here is smaller than our usual 962 clauses, because we only can consider those clauses where both actor and undergoer have been mentioned before. Okay, so let's very briefly look at how we can get this from our annotations. Let's take this as our clause. This is an example clause, transitive clause again. Tolu and tau, modului moisia. 3 people helped him, right? So we have a referent here, Tolu and tau, 3 people. We have the predicate, it's an actor voice. And we have isia, a pronoun, he. Both of them have been mentioned before. They both have refined indexes. 3 people's number 17, and isia is number 9. So we look at the previous discourse. We look at what happened before in the story. Oops. And I'm only giving you the English translation here because it wouldn't fit on the slide, not enough space. So what was happening before was he was looking at the girl constantly. The bicycle hit a stone. The avocado spilled out of the basket. Not long after that, there were 3 children. The 3 people helped him. So that's how the story goes. So we have our clause annotations here with the 2 hashtags. And then we look at the previous clause. Not long after that, there were 3 children. So we have the 3 children here. They have the same index as the 3 people here. They're referring to the same 3 people. The sentence before, the avocado spilled out of the basket. None of the 2 are involved. The bicycle hit the stone. Neither. He was looking at the girl constantly. So this pronoun here is referring to the same referent as the pronoun here. So now if we want to count, we would say, okay, the referential distance of Tolu and tau is 1 because it was mentioned in the previous sentence. The referential distance of isia is 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because it was mentioned 4 sentences ago. So in this case, then, we have an actor voice clause, and the referential distance of the actor argument is shorter than that of the undergoer argument, right? Because this one is 1 and that one is 4. So actor is closer than undergoer, and we're talking about an actor voice construction. So this sentence here, Torontao modului moisia, is one of these 33 instances here, right? So does referential distance tell us anything about voice choice? Not really that much, a little bit. There are some tendencies, right? But it's not much. It is statistically significant, but it's a very slow effect, low effect only, small effect. And one more, topic persistence. Topic persistence is similar to referential distance, but this time we are looking to the right. We're looking to the following discourse, not to the previous one. And topic persistent counts all clauses following a referential expression that contain the same referent. And we stop counting after 10 clauses. That's again an arbitrary value. You can continue counting till the end, but basically what people have agreed on is counting to 10. And again, we can also look at the relative persistence of two arguments. So we can say, is the actor more persistent than the undergoer, or is the undergoer more persistent than the actor, or are they equally persistent? So again, let's look at how we can get that from our data. We take the same sentence, Toluntau modului moesia, the 3 people helped him, and then we look how the story continues. So it continues like this. The avocados were put back into the basket. After putting them back into the basket, he went and the 3 children went too. And then it goes on. So again, we have our 3 people and we have Isia, him. And then we look to the right. The avocados were put back into the basket, and here we have 0 argument by the boys. It's the 3 people who put them back into the basket. So we annotated that. After putting them into the basket, it's again the 3 people. He went. That's our pronoun here, the boy. And the 3 children went too. And that's again the 3 who helped him. So if we now were only looking at 3 clauses, so basically we should be looking at 10 clauses, right? But I only listed 3. So then the actor argument again has a higher persistence because it's mentioned 3 times in the following 3 clauses. Whereas the undergoer argument is only mentioned 1 time, right? So again, let's look. Actor argument has a higher persistence than the undergoer argument. We are talking about an actor voice construction. So this sentence would again show up here in the 95 tokens here. So does topic persistence tell us anything about voice choice in Totoli? Even less so than referential distance, right? This looks all very equal, and indeed it is statistically not significant. Right? We might say maybe if the undergoer, if the undergoer is a little bit more persistent. No, if the undergoer is more persistent, we'll get more undergoer voice. Sorry. Okay, so but topic persistence does not really tell us anything about voice choice in Totoli. Now, as I said, we have investigated many more factors, but if we were just looking at, topicality, which has been done for a lot of languages, also for Austronesian languages, like referential distance and topic persistence, we can say that both of them are no really good predictors for voice choice in Totoli. And we couldn't have answered that questions without looking at our corpus, really, and without really counting what's going on there. So much for the Totoli study. And I will now hand over to Katherine, who will be talking about the Kamang study.
Yes, thank you. Just share my screen. So you've just heard about the Totoli study, which is quite far along, and they've got lots of results, but our study has just begun. So the whole project is the typology of alternating verbs, and that's within a project funded by the Dutch Research Council, Exceptions Rule, Lexical Conditions on Grammatical Structure at the University of Amsterdam. Now, the first question is, what is an alternating verb, if we're going to make a typology of them? And you've just seen that with Totoli. So you could have one verb in different constructions, so an active voice or undergoer voice in that case, with the same arguments. And actually, alternating verbs can appear in many languages and in many different forms. So for example, in English, a completely different alternation to the Totoli one is ditransitive constructions. So for example, with give, you can have construction A here, I give Pia the book, or construction B, I give the book to Pia. And there you see there's different word order for the two different arguments, and the arguments are coded differently. Now, what's interesting about these is that not all languages, not all verbs can alternate with these different constructions. So as you can see in this example with donate, actually you can't have both constructions. So give can have both constructions, but donate, even though it also takes two arguments, can only use the construction with two in it. So she donated $100 to the Red Cross, that's fine, but she donated the Red Cross $100 is not grammatical. Now, this leads us to ask, in general, what kinds of alternations exist in different languages? Which verbs can and cannot alternate? So, for example, in English, why can donate not alternate, but give can? And if a verb can alternate, what are the factors that influence the choice of which construction? So that's similar to the question that was asked in Totoli. Now, we also want to apply the GRAID annotations to our own corpora, so to Kamang, as you've heard, but also to Chechen, which is a Dagestanian language in Russia. And we're also going to use the multicast corpora that are available on the website that Sonja showed you at the beginning to compare different languages. So how can we use GRAID to look for alternating verbs? Now, on the multicast website, there is an English corpus that we can use. So for example, with the construction I showed you earlier with give, I give Pia the book. The GRAID annotations in English, the second object, so here the book, is tagged with P2. So if you can see in the example here, which I've taken from the corpus online, the example is, he gave me the green card. Now me here, you can see is P, but the green card is tagged with P2. And that means you can easily count the verbs that appear with P2. Because in the second construction, I give the book to Pia, I found another example here, and he gave them to me, so, and he gave them to me. To me is tagged differently, so here you don't have a P2. And that's how you can tell with GRAID which construction is used for this verb. So what I did very simply was just to count all of the different verbs that can appear with a P2. And in the whole corpus, the multicast English corpus, I found 19 different verbs. And as you can see, so sometimes the numbers are very low. So for many of them, the numbers with P2, so the construction with P2, there's just 1 or 2 or 3 examples. But for some verbs, you can see that there's many more examples. And then compared with the total number of examples in the corpus, so that's constructions with both P2 and with a different construction, so with 2. And then I compared those, and you can see that the proportions of which construction are very different. So all the way from 64% to 2/3 of the examples using the P2 construction, all the way down to less than 1% for very common verbs like get and do. They can appear in this construction, but very, very rarely. So then we ask the question, well, why? What makes speakers choose one over the other? If it's possible, why do they hardly ever use it for certain verbs? Or why do speakers use it very frequently for other verbs? Now, other scholars have already researched this question in English using other English corpora and have found that the preference of particular verbs means that they're more likely to appear with one or the other. And also it makes a difference whether the argument is a pronoun or an NP, so a full noun phrase. And that's something that we can also look at in our example of the English corpus, multicast corpus. So I looked at the percentage of P2s in the corpus that were non-human, that were speech act participants, so the first or second person, or third person human. As you can see, the P2s are 99% non-human. So in I give her the book, all the constructions that have a P2 like this, almost always non-human. And what about the P? So in that same construction, I give her the book, her is the P. If you look at this middle column here, you can see that they're over half first and second person, and then 29% third person human. So they're only 16% non-human, which if you compare with all of the P arguments in the whole corpus, you can see is very different. So you can see that 85% of P arguments in the whole corpus are non-human. And if you compare that with P arguments in a construction with a P2, you can see how different that is. And you can see that humanness obviously plays a big role in whether the construction with a P2 is used or not. So that was an example of using a corpus from the multicast collection of corpora. So you can also ask research questions of corpora that already exist. But we want to also create new corpora, well, new graded corpora of Kamang and Chechen. I'll talk to you about Kamang today, of course, language in Indonesia. Now it's on Alor, and we're treating it as one language. There's different literature that says it's multiple languages, but we're treating it as one language with different dialects. And the dialect that we're looking at, it's not marked on this map, but if you can see my cursor, there's some villages just here that we're looking at. So quickly, typological profile of Kamang, which is an Alor-Panto language. It's the usual word order is SOV. It has several paradigms of independent pronouns. So that's quite unusual, and that's something that we want to mark later. It's quite isolating, but of the Alor-Panto languages, Kamang has the richest morphology. And part of that includes this verbal marking with prefixes that Sonja talked you through earlier, which index the P argument. And that's quite unusual typologically. Only about 7% of the world's languages have this. So it is an interesting phenomenon. Now, to go back to our examples that you saw before, so before you saw that there's P arguments, which are indexed by these different prefixes. So here we have the patientive prefix, and here we have the genitive prefix, both of which are for transitive constructions. And then on the left of the screen here, we can see that the same prefixes, so na for the first, for the patientive, and ne for the genitive, they're used also to reference an S in an intransitive construction. So it's the same marker for some verbs. Intransitive constructions, it indexes S, and for some it indexes P. And as promised, there are multiple different prefixes. So there are 6 prefix series. I've said 7 because there's also the self-benefactive series, which I won't talk about today. But these 6 series, we can call them series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but they're also often referenced with these names like patientive, locative, genitive, dative, directive, commentative, or assistive. But don't pay too much attention to these case marking names because they don't necessarily correspond with what we might think of as the functions of those particular case markers, which is why I want to also call them just series 1 to 6. Now, we're talking about alternating verbs. So not only do different verbs take different prefixes, but the same verb can take a prefix or not. So in the first example, kokuduma gafafa, we see that there's a patientive prefix on fafa, search for, which indexes the P argument, the child. And in the B example, you can see that fafa, the same verb, does not have a prefix, even though there is a P in this sentence, lice. 2 women search for each other's lice in turns. So here we have search for child with a prefix, and below we have search for lice with no prefix. Now, that's quite easy to explain here because we can say the difference is just there's a prefix if the P is animate, or no prefix if the P is inanimate. However, animacy doesn't always explain the choice. So in a study by Fedden et al., they found that 79% of the series 1 pat prefixes index animate objects, but that means that 21% index inanimate objects. So animacy cannot be the only factor influencing the choice. And indeed, here is an example of an inanimate P with this patientive prefix. So a folded rope is lying draped over a basket. Basket is the P here, and that's inanimate, of course, and you still have the patient prefix, which before only indexed an animate object. And to show you the same kind of phenomenon, but from a different prefix series, so to add to the complication, we can also see that the same verb here, so the example is, we had tied its hind and front legs together. We tied them then, and then the sentence continues. But fal, the verb for bind or tie, in the first instance, it has no prefix. And in the second instance, you can see that it does have the prefix. But in both cases, they're indexing the same argument. So here, of course, animacy cannot be the decisive factor because it's the exact same argument. So we need to look for other reasons. So we're asking of our corpus which verbs appear with which prefixes or 0, and what factors alongside animacy play a role in choosing which prefix and whether you use a prefix or not. So we're also using GRAID. As you've seen all the tags before, I'll just show you how we've customized it for Kamang. We want to show that these prefixes are affixes and not independent forms, which is why we use the hyphen at the beginning. we're interested in whether there's a difference between singular or plural reference. That's why we've got the plural tag. And we've also added a 3-letter code for which prefix series. So this is lock. So we've added lock to the tag for the argument. Now here's an example from that we've tagged already with GRAID. And again, this time the example is, so they searched for him. Again, we've got the verb fafa with the patient prefix, and there we've added pat to the tag because it's from the pat series, the patientive prefix series. As I mentioned, we have various independent pronoun paradigms. So here we've got WPRO, which stands for weak pronoun, so that we can distinguish ga from the basic pronoun series, which would be gal. And also we've got a 0 argument here. So they searched for him. Him is not mentioned, but we add a 0 argument. And as well as differentiating between human and non-human, we also want to differentiate between human animate or inanimate. And that's why we've got this additional AN tag here, which stands for animate, because here they're searching for the frog. This is from the frog story. So a quick note about our corpus. We've got data gathered by 3 researchers across several decades. And now we've got those texts and a lexicon in Flex. So some of you may be using Flex. And we can then export the text from Flex so that we can work with the videos in Elan, which Maria will talk to you a little bit about in a moment. Our corpus is quite small. Our full corpus is about 40 texts, different lengths and genres. But we've selected about 22 texts for GRAID, texts that are more narrative. So we've got longer stretches of discourse that we can track references through. Now, a limitation of our corpus is that that's only about 6 speakers. They're all male over 40 years old, which unfortunately is to be expected because Kamang is quite endangered and it's not being transmitted to children. So we are quite limited with what data we can collect. And also, unfortunately, almost all the texts are from the same speaker. So unfortunately, our corpus is not as diverse as it could be, but we still think we're going to get some useful results. And just for comparison, so some of you may also have smaller corpora than this big Totoli corpus, this lovely big Totoli corpus. So Totoli is a much larger corpus, and the graded clauses, there are over 3,000. Now we're aiming for about 1,000. And we're concentrating just on narratives, which is part of the multicast corpus collection. Aim is to mostly focus on narratives, whereas Totoli looked at various different genres. But that's fine. If you don't have hugely varied corpus, you can still use these annotation schemata and still get some useful results. Now our next steps, as I said, we're just at the beginning of this. I don't have any nice graphs to show you, unfortunately, like from the Totoli study. But we're going to continue adding the GRAID annotations to our texts. As you can see, we already have our GRAID tier started. We're going to add reflex and refind. As you've seen, that's very useful for tracking various things. And then we're going to analyze all of that and hopefully get some results to our questions. And now I'm going to pass on to Maria, who will talk to you a bit about technical side of things.
Yes. Just 1 second. Yeah, just now to finish the presentation, I will talk very briefly about the technicalities and the steps to set up the files for an annotation. GRAID is thought for being annotated in Elan, which is the program that you can see here and the examples that Katherine has shown. But if you, well, elan is very practical because it includes, you can include the sound file of this recording, and the sound file is time aligned with the annotations. However, if you don't want to use elan, you have seen that everything is text annotation, so all the labels are inserted manually. And so you can do it in any file that supports text. If you have your data parsed in Excel or in Word, you can also add a new line for grade, for reflex, and for refine, and insert the labels there. If you start from scratch, then you should consider that the process as a whole, and then choose an option that can be easily exported for statistical analysis. For example, Excel would be fine, Word would be probably a little bit more complicated, but we can talk about later about your data, where you have it, where you parsed it, and which alternatives you can find to elan if you don't want to use it. And but however, we used elan, and that's what I'm going to explain now. We used it because we had our texts parsed in Toolbox, and we could easily import them into elan by going to File and import the Toolbox file. But for example, Katherine is working with Flex files, and you can also import them into elan. You can also import chat files, or for example, if you have an Excel file in CSV, or if you have it in Prat, you see that there are different options. And once you have imported a file into elan, you need to create a linguistic type for grade, for refined, and for reflex. Here are you need to add symbolic subdivision to it and close. And then another step is to add those tiers in the annotation. You need to create a grade line for each participant. For example, in this one, we have a participant, Saniasa. We create a tier for this one. We make this line dependent from the morpheme line, and we assign grade type. And we do the same for reflex and refine tiers. And we can start annotating. This is how an annotated file would look like in elan. Notice again the structure. As I said, we think it's best to make the grade tier dependent from the morpheme tier, because as you can see in this Totoli example that we had already before, you have here one word which is in one annotation, Nipuruk Nako, and for this word you may want to annotate several labels, for example the predicate and also the pronominal argument. If you don't make the grade tier dependent from the morpheme tier, you would need to annotate all this information in one slot, and that would be a mess and probably very complicated for the export and for the statistical analysis. And just two more details. If if you are annotating in elan, you can see that 0 arguments and also sentence beginnings are not to find in the text, of course. And so we need to create extra slots. And this is how it would like. That's also very easy. You can, with a right click, you can add an annotation before or after any slot. And this would be all from our side. These are the references that we cited today, and we thank you very much for your attention. We will be happy now to answer your questions and also to listen from your data, if you would like to apply these annotations, and you have questions about how to adapt this schema in your the format of data that you're using, or whatever you want to ask. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sonja, Maria, and Katherine. So much to learn, I think, for today's class, yeah? So for me, myself, I learned that it is, let's say, an updated way to annotate corpus. And it is important for us to know the updated way to annotate the corpus. So our corpus, which we built maybe personally, can be used by other linguists in other side of the world. And it is also for me interesting to know that how typological research can be done quantitatively. So from the example given by Sonja, that referential distance or topicality, or how alternation, verb alternation can be, statistically count by using this annotation. So once again, thank you very much. And in our chat box, we already have some questions. So there are some questions from, I think it's Ibu Poppy Siahaan. So if you are here, can you please speak directly, and I don't know, could you please stop your screen sharing, maybe, yeah, Maria, so I can see Ibu Poppy. So Ibu Poppy, please, I invite you to ask your question directly to the speakers.
I just found out that I asked 3 questions, and one of them I sent it to everyone, and the last 2 questions I only sent it to Annick. Sorry. So my first question refers to the example from Maria. Hello, Maria. 4 orang anak. I think it was from Totoli. And then the orang. This is not very important question, I think.
I can share the screen if you want for this example. Yeah, but
I think you annotated the word orang as the noun instead of anak. So
yeah, well, that's also an important question. Katherine is the expert in classifiers here, but it's always very difficult to define where is the line, what is a classifier system and what is not. So and there are languages in which this is obligatory, and there are languages which is not at all. And for example, in English, you can have sentences like a glass of water, and then you wouldn't say that English has a classifier system. And then Indonesian is somehow in between. And so you need to decide how you annotate your data. In this case, I decided that it's not always the case that you need to use a classifier in Indonesian. So I decided not to annotate orang as a classifier and then put the reference index under anak. And if this is my decision, then I have to be consequent in the GRAID analysis, and then always put the reference under orang because I decided to analyze it in the same way I would analyze this glass of water in English. But if you analyze your language and you say that it has classifier, then you have to be consequent. You have to analyze it consequently throughout the text.
I think so, no?
Sorry?
I think you have to be consequent, the whole, annotating the whole, all the text, no? Not like, yeah. Okay, here I classify orang as the noun, and then there.
No, exactly. Depending on what you decide. If you want to decide that Indonesian has a classifier system, then you don't analyze orang as the noun, but anak, and then you do this throughout the text. But if you decide it's not the case and you want to analyze those noun phrases as a glass of water in English, then you also analyze these noun phrases in the same way during the whole text.
Okay.
Okay, Ibu Poppy, are you satisfied, or maybe you can chat Maria in the chat box while we have because we have some other questions. Is
Sure.
that okay? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So the next question is from Ibu Ita Fitria, and I think this question is for Sonja. So compared to Van Valin and La Pola, who always mention participant roles, in your transitivity analysis, you didn't mention agent, effector, experiencer, or etc. So the question is, why don't you analyze those participant roles in your Totoli project, Sonja?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's true. There are different levels on how specifically you can analyze your semantic arguments, right? We are just talking about actors and undergoers here because everything else is not relevant, right? So you have different voice systems, like for example, the Philippine type voice systems, where you have different voices where the semantic role plays a role, right? You have a patient voice, you have a locative voice, you have a conveyance voice where the theme argument becomes the subject, and so on. But in Totoli, it's not relevant. In Totoli, it doesn't matter whether the undergoer, which the undergoer is basically the overall label. It subsumes all the other undergoer-like arguments. So in Totoli, it doesn't matter whether the undergoer is a patient or a theme or whatever, a benefactive, right? So we can just generalize over that and just talk about undergoers and agents. It also doesn't matter whether the actor argument is an experiencer or an agent. So we can make this generalization as Van Valen and La Pola also do, right? They also talk about the macro roles, actor and undergoer. And then if it becomes relevant for your analysis, you can split them up into maybe agents, experiences, and so on, or patient, theme, and so on. But for our analysis and for our research question, that's not relevant. And that's why we only talk about actors and undergoers.
Okay, thank you, Sonja. So let's just move to the next question. If Ibu Felicia is here, so
yes,
I invite you. Yeah, please, I invite you to raise your question, please.
So I have heard the explanation from Katherine about the amount of corpus. Is there any standard to determine the amount of corpus used in the research, such as you say that the Kamang study used only 100 corpus, if I'm not mistaken? Is there any standard to determine the amount of it?
So the multicast project, they aim for at least 1,000 clauses. And a clause was, they're the things marked by the two hashtags. So that doesn't mean 1,000 long sentences, because the clauses can be smaller. So maybe 1,000 sounds like a lot. But yeah, that's an arbitrary number. But for the multicast project, that's what they aim for, around 1,000. So if you can get 1,000, that's obviously very good. But for your own purposes, maybe with fewer, you could also find some useful information by using this system. But obviously, if you have very, very few, then you're not going to learn more by using this tagging system than if you could just look at it if it's such a small amount of data. So ideally, you should look for at least 1,000 clauses.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Once again, I would like to invite Ibu Poppy. She would like to know about humanness. I think this question is for Sonja. Ibu Poppy, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here all the time,
Yes,
actually.
please, yeah.
Yeah, I am referring to the, what do you call it? The statistic, apa namanya? It's called humanness, yeah. Where is the chat? Can you show us your graphs, please, Sonja? I think the graph is titled humanness or something. No, my question was just also quite simple. Did you calculate the amounts manually, or did you use R to use it? Yeah, I think that one, yeah, something like that. Because I think, if I remember, you use around 900 relative clauses. Yes, this one, I think. So this counts like, there are tokens, right? 39, 144, 218.
Yes.
Did you count them manually?
No, we used R for that.
Okay.
So obviously, the larger your corpus gets, the more difficult is it to just count it manually. So we exported our data into R, and we counted with R. Yeah. You can also use, like Catherine, for example. Sorry?
You exported the data from ELAN to Excel first, and then from Excel to...
No, we exported it to Toolbox, I think, and then to R. But there are different ways of doing it. So, for example, Catherine, for her little study on English, used Excel, right, Catherine? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Poppy. So the next question is from Ibu Santi Julianti. So for Ibu Santi, Sonja, Catherine, and Maria, the programs you have just introduced is quite new for her. So she would like to know whether, where she can find the programs and the manuals you have just introduced. So this is about GRAID, I think, Refine, and also Reflex.
Yes, in the references, you can find the references for the manuals. I think we are going to share this presentation, right?
Yes,
Bonnie?
we do.
Yeah. So you will find it there. And before we share it, then we could also add the link to download ELAN if you want.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, we also had this slide with the multicast website, and you find the link there. And that's where you can also download the manuals for the annotation schemes. And for the programs like ELAN, Toolbox, Flex, we can maybe then also add the links. But if you Google that, you will also very easily find that, and it's all freely available. So.
Okay, thank you. So I also have some technical, I think, not problem, but small questions. Yeah, I think. So Sonja, for example, I have my old data. Yeah, so I annotate the data based on, 2010 until 2014 trend. Yeah, without this grid, without this refine or reflex. So is it Maria has just shown to us, yeah, how make a new layer in our ELAN files, for example. So is there any other technique or you know, a simple way to update my old data? So you, for example, can also use my old data.
So where do you have your data parsed?
So in ELAN, but I think the version of my ELAN is very old, you know. So I don't know how can I update this old data.
Probably you could download the new version of ELAN and then open these ELAN files where you have your data, and then you just need to add a new tier and start the annotation there. So you can do that if you think, or if somehow it's not compatible with the new version of ELAN. I would export the old ELAN file into a text, for example, into a toolbox file or into a flex file, and then import it in the new ELAN version.
Yeah,
but
so,
if you have this old data, no problem. It's not a problem. Also, many of the files that we annotated were recorded and also were annotated a while ago, 10 years ago, for example. We just opened them in ELAN and we just added this GRAID tier and this refined and reflex tier and started annotating or introducing these labels into this old data.
Yeah, yeah, of course, it's a good news for me because, you know, I have this small data, but I don't want to lose it. So because this ELAN and everything, you know, runs very fast, while I just, you know, stay here and left behind this technology. Well, Ibu Bapak, any of you still have any questions? So I invite you to ask your questions to our presenters today. You may raise your hand or just unmute your microphone.
Well, I have another question, if I may. Sorry
Yes,
to
please.
ask too many.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So I am new with this ELAN, yeah, because my background is like metaphors, so it's not. But I have this ELAN. Can you not hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So you said that you imported the annotation from ELAN into Toolbox. So you are annotating in ELAN, not in Toolbox, not the other way around, yeah?
Well, the other way around as well. So there are many steps. So for example, in our case, but it depends on how you record your data and how you want to do it. In our case, we started, well, the Totoli project started a long time ago. They recorded the files and then they annotated them in ELAN before knowing that we were going to annotate with GRAID. And then those files were exported into Toolbox and they were parsed there. So they were analyzed. So all the things, all the lines with the morphemes and so on, with the actor voice and then with the root and so on, that was done in Toolbox. Then some years after that, we had this corpus in Toolbox and we wanted to annotate some of these Toolbox files with GRAID. So we imported Toolbox files into ELAN. Yeah.
I am actually, I have this ELAN that I am doing gesture, yeah. So I also like annotate the gesture, but I also want to use the morphological glossing, the parsing. So is it, and I heard that you don't use, I mean, you don't annotate the morphemes in ELAN, but in Toolbox. But is it true? Because I have no experience with Toolbox, so I have to learn it. Where can I learn Toolbox? Is there like a manual? Like, can I learn it by myself, or is there a course for it?
There's definitely an ELAN. and also a toolbox manual. However, so we use toolbox, but that's not the only way to annotate the morphemes. So there are people that annotate and parse directly in Elan.
Really?
Maybe you already have your files there and you don't want to export them into toolbox and then import them back into Elan, then you should probably talk to, I don't know how to do it, but maybe you can find it in the Elan manual, how you can automatize a little bit this morpheme glossing process in Elan.
Mm-hmm.
So you can definitely do that. And that's not what we did because we already had a toolbox corpus, but if you already have your data in Elan and you want to do all the annotation there, you can do it.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
I think there's a newer function in Elan nowadays where you can actually do the morpheme glossing, and you can compile a lexicon as well in Elan. But we've
Really?
never done that. I've never done it, and I don't know how it works. But as Maria said, if you look at the website, you might find a manual. And also you can always write to the MPI. They are usually very helpful. So if you have problems, maybe you can look around.
Is it easier? You think to do it in Toolbox? I mean, to do this parsing in Toolbox and then import it to Elan?
Well, Toolbox has a steep learning curve. I think it's a bit complex at the beginning, so
right.
It's not the easiest program to learn if you have to set it up yourself and start from scratch. So
Okay.
I would probably recommend having a look at this Elan function, but as I said, I've never used it, so I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean,
okay,
if you want to start Toolbox, there's a large community, and if you are in Cologne, you can.
Oh, really?
We can have a look at that together, if you like.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, your institute is not so far, right? So you can just jump to Sonja right away, Poppy. Well, we still have about 5 minutes, so I invite Ibu Bapak who would like to raise some other questions. Just unmute your microphone, or you can raise your hand.
Yes, excuse me.
Yes, please. Ibu Tri Rina Budiwati.
Okay, thank you, Bu Ani. Yeah. Thank you. This is very very interesting to have Maria, Sonja, and Katherine here. And I have a question. Now I'm conducting a research on Islamic preach. Well, this Islamic preach consists of 2 languages, Bahasa Arab or Arabic and English. So do you have any suggestion for me what kind of tool to analyze using corpus? I have at least 15 preaches, 15 preaches to be analyzed. And then I'm still a little bit confused of using which corpus, which is very suitable for my analysis, because these 2 languages, Arabic, I mean, I only listen, so I do not write in Arabic, but I only listen the Arabic and also listen the English. So I would like you to give me suggestion about the toolkits. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bu Ani.
Yeah, thank you, Ibu Tri. So please, Maria, you may start. Thank you.
Yes, just one follow-up question. So you have the recordings, right? That's the only thing you have. You don't have text.
No, I don't have text, and then I have to transcribe.
You have to transcribe.
Yes.
Well, then in this case, if I think we would recommend Elan, this program, because you upload the file, the recording, and then you can do time-aligned annotation. So you annotate exactly in that part of the recording where this part of this bridge is set. So you annotate it here aligned, and then if you want, so then when you have the Elan file and you want to listen again to that part, then you can click there and you can play it. And for audio files, I think this is a very good option. Elan is free. You can download it for free, and we will add the link to the manual and also to the program, but you can also find it in Google. I think that would be a good one, since you are working with audio files and you need to start the annotation from scratch.
And then, although it is bilingual.
Well, you that's okay. That's each file has a different language, right? You don't use the two languages in one file.
But the preach contains two languages. For example, yeah, yes.
That's not a problem. You have two options. Either you just write it in the way it is, and then maybe an annotation is in English and then another annotation is in Arabic. But you can also create different tiers. So you can have one for the Arabic annotations and then one for the other language. And if you happen to have 3 different languages, you can have different tiers, different lines. You can also create different lines if you have different participants, different speakers, different singers.
Okay,
so if you want to separate the languages, then you may want to create 2 tiers.
Okay, thank you.
But for audio files, because it's time aligned. The annotation is time aligned.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. So, Ibu Bapak, I'm afraid that I think we still, so our time is up, yeah, so we still have 1 minute to go. So I think our discussion session is enough. I'm sorry for that. So if you still have questions, you may ask Katherine, Maria, or Sonja per mail. So we can give you their email address and other contact numbers. So Bapak Ibu, once again for Maria, Katherine, Sonja, terima kasih sudah hadir dalam kelas daring linguistik pada hari ini. Ilmu yang kalian berikan sangat bermanfaat bagi kami semua tentang cara baru dalam menganotasi korpus. Dan semoga hal yang kami pelajari hari ini bisa kami gunakan untuk memutakhirkan pengetahuan kami tentang anotasi korpus dalam bahasa apapun. Dan yang terpenting untuk saya pada hari ini adalah penjelasan bagaimana typological research bisa dilakukan secara kuantitatif. Baik Bapak Ibu, semoga kuliah hari ini bermanfaat bagi Bapak Ibu, dan jika ada saran, kritik dan sebagainya, atau mungkin kita perlu mengadakan pelatihan Elan lagi, kami tunggu saran dan komentar Bapak Ibu untuk perbaikan kelas linguistik pada masa mendatang. Untuk materi nanti kami bagikan melalui Ibu Rosa, dan hal lain akan disampaikan lewat email atau WhatsApp. Sekali lagi terima kasih Bapak Ibu, Sonja, Katherine, Maria, sukses untuk hari ini, dan Selamat sore, selamat melanjutkan aktivitas, dan bagi yang boleh beristirahat, selamat beristirahat. Selamat sore dari Jakarta dan selamat siang untuk Eropa. Terima kasih, sampai bertemu lagi.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Bapak.